Nobody in my family showed up for my master degree graduation. Not my parents and not my sister. They left 5 premium front row seats completely empty. A few weeks later, my father sent me a text message demanding $6,000 to cover a shortage for my sister catering bill at her upcoming wedding. I did not argue or cry. I opened my banking app and sent him exactly $6 with a memo that simply read "Best wishes." Then I told my husband to change all the locks on our doors immediately. That same night, my father called the police on me and tried to have me arrested for grand larceny. He had absolutely no idea that his little stunt was going to end with me dropping a foreclosure notice right onto his plate in front of his wealthy future in-laws at a 5-star steakhouse. Before I share the rest of my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. The heavy embossed leather folder containing my master degree in data analytics was finally in my hands. The massive university auditorium was a roaring ocean of sound. Thousands of people were cheering, clapping, and blowing air horns as names echoed over the professional sound system. I am 35 years old, and for the past 5 years I have sacrificed my sleep, my weekends, and my own sanity to reach this exact spot on the stage. The bright stage lights beat down on my shoulders, warming the black velvet of my graduation gown. I could feel the stiff cardboard of my cap secured tightly against my silk press, and for a brief shining second, I felt an overwhelming surge of pure triumph. Getting to this stage had been the hardest journey of my life. Working full-time as a senior data analyst, while raising 2 beautiful children and managing a household, left zero room for error. There were countless nights where I would cook dinner, help my kids with their math homework, put them to bed, and then drag myself to my home office to write complex coding algorithms until 3 in the morning. I drank enough coffee to fuel a small city. I missed out on family vacations and movie nights. I pushed myself to the absolute brink of mental and physical exhaustion because I wanted to prove something. I wanted to build a bulletproof future for my family, and deep down, I wanted to finally earn the respect of the parents who had spent my entire life treating me like an afterthought. As the university dean shook my hand and handed me the diploma cover, I turned to face the professional photographer. I flashed my brightest, most genuine smile. The camera flashed, capturing a moment of victory that I had paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears. As I let go of the dean hand and continued my walk across the wide wooden stage, I instinctively turned my gaze upward toward the second-floor balcony. I found them immediately. My husband Terrence was standing right at the railing, completely ignoring the usher who was gesturing for him to sit down. Terrence is a tall, broad-shouldered man who rarely shows loud emotion in public, but right now he was screaming my name at the top of his lungs. He held a giant neon green poster board that read, "That is my wife, the Data Queen." Beside him, my 12-year-old son Malik was recording the entire moment on his phone, a huge, proud grin stretching across his face. My 9-year-old daughter Aaliyah was jumping up and down so hard her braids were bouncing wildly in the air. Seeing my immediate family up there, the beautiful, brilliant family Terrence and I had built together, filled my chest with a warmth so deep it brought tears to my eyes. Terrence had been my absolute rock through this entire 5-year ordeal. He took over the household chores, he spent his weekends taking the kids to the park so I could have absolute quiet to study for my finals, and he never once complained about the financial strain of my tuition. Looking up at the balcony, I felt entirely loved, entirely seen, and entirely validated. Then I reached the edge of the stage and looked down into the VIP section. The university had allowed graduates with high honors to reserve premium seating in the first few rows. 6 months ago, I paid extra to secure 5 specific seats in row G, right near the center aisle, so my parents and my sister would have the perfect unobstructed view of my graduation. I had planned it meticulously. I sent them the digital tickets, I printed physical copies for my father, who never trusted smartphones, and I sent calendar invites to ensure everyone knew the exact time and location. I looked at row G. I found seats 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. They were empty. 5 metal folding chairs sat completely bare, staring back at me like a physical blow to the chest. There was no coat draped over the back of the chairs. There was no abandoned program resting on the seats. They were utterly untouched. My stomach plummeted, hitting the floor with a sickening weight. The roaring cheers of the auditorium suddenly sounded muffled and distant, like I was submerged underwater. My father Vernon, my mother Brenda, and my younger sister Chloe were nowhere to be found. I slowed my pace as I walked down the padded ramp leading off the stage, my eyes frantically scanning the surrounding rows. Maybe they got stuck in traffic. Maybe they went to the concession stand to get water. Maybe they were running late and got forced to sit in the overflow section at the back of the arena. I tried to feed myself every logical excuse I could think of to cushion the devastating reality that was sinking into my bones. But I knew the truth. I knew my family. Just 3 days ago, I sat at my kitchen island on a phone call with my mother Brenda. She had sworn up and down that they were ready for the big day. She talked for 20 minutes about the expensive tailored suit Vernon had bought specifically for the occasion. She bragged about the silk dress she planned to wear, and how Chloe was bringing her wealthy white fiancé Connor so he could see how educated and successful our family was. They had promised me they would be sitting in those front row seats cheering me on. But looking at those 5 empty chairs, the familiar heavy ache of rejection settled into my chest. This was not a sudden emergency. This was not a traffic jam. This was a deliberate choice. Growing up in our household in Atlanta, my parents operated strictly on a system of conditional love and toxic respectability. Vernon and Brenda obsessed over image status and the opinions of their country club friends. From the moment my younger sister Chloe learned how to walk, she became the undisputed golden child of the family. Chloe was bubbly, highly social, and possessed a talent for manipulating my parents into giving her whatever she desired. When Chloe turned 16, they threw her a $10,000 extravaganza at a luxury hotel. When I turned 16, Brenda bought me a sheet cake from the grocery store, and Vernon told me to be grateful we had a roof over our heads. I was always the responsible one, the difficult one, the daughter who asked too many questions and refused to be Brenda personal unpaid maid. When it was time for college, Vernon refused to co-sign my student loans, claiming he needed to preserve his credit to buy a new luxury car. I was forced to take out predatory high-interest loans and work 2 miserable retail jobs just to afford community college before transferring to a state school. Meanwhile, when Chloe went to a private university out of state, Vernon and Brenda paid her tuition in full out of pocket. They expected me to fail. They expected me to remain the struggling background character in the movie of Chloe Perfect Life. And now that I had finally achieved something monumental, something that outshined my sister's undergraduate degree in communications, they could not even grant me 2 hours of their time. I reached the bottom of the ramp and clutched the leather diploma cover to my chest. The usher directed me down the center aisle back toward the graduate seating area. Hundreds of strangers clapped for me as I walked past them. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and grandparents of other students smiled at me, their eyes shining with pride for a woman they did not even know. It was a beautiful display of human kindness, but it only magnified the gaping hole left by my own blood relatives. I took my seat among my classmates, smoothing the fabric of my gown over my knees. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high. I refused to let anyone see the tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I refused to give Vernon, Brenda, or Chloe the power to break me in public. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to spend my graduation day crying over people who viewed my existence as an inconvenience. As the final names were called, and the university president gave his closing remarks, I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress beneath my gown and pulled out my phone. I needed a distraction. I needed to focus on anything other than the 5 empty chairs sitting just 30 feet away from me. I unlocked the screen, expecting to see text messages from my parents apologizing for missing the ceremony or explaining whatever supposed crisis had delayed them. There were no text messages from my parents. There were no missed calls. There was absolutely nothing from Vernon, Brenda, or Chloe. Instead, a notification popped up at the top of my screen. It was an alert from Instagram telling me that my sister Chloe had just gone live. I stared at the notification, my thumb hovering over the screen. A dark sinking feeling told me not to open it. My intuition warned me that whatever was on the other side of that notification would only pour salt on a fresh wound. But the need to know, the need to understand why I had been abandoned on my graduation day, overpowered my logic. I tapped the alert, and the video loaded instantly, plunging me into a reality that would forever alter the course of my life and the definition of my family. I slid into the passenger seat of Terrence's SUV, letting out a long breath. I felt like I had been holding for 5 long years. The black velvet of my graduation gown clung to my back, damp with sweat from the auditorium heat. In the rearview mirror, I caught Malik and Aliyah buckling their seatbelts, still buzzing with the adrenaline of shouting my name from the balcony. Terrence reached across the center console and squeezed my knee, his thumb rubbing a slow, reassuring circle against my skin. He did not say a single word about the 5 empty seats in row G. He did not need to. His silence was a protective shield, giving me the space to process the massive betrayal without forcing me to vocalize the deep humiliation I felt inside. I unzipped my gown, pulling the heavy fabric away from my neck, trying to physically shed the weight of my family absence. My phone vibrated in my purse. It was a sharp, quick buzz that cut right through the comforting hum of the car engine. I pulled the device out fully, expecting a congratulatory text from a coworker or a client who knew what today meant to me. Instead, an Instagram notification flashed across my lock screen. "Chloe is live right now." My thumb hovered over the notification. Every survival instinct I had meticulously developed over 35 years told me to swipe left and delete the alert. I knew my sister. Chloe did not go live on social media unless she had an audience and a performance to deliver. But a darker, more masochistic curiosity took over my logic. I needed to know exactly what was so urgent that my own parents and sister could not spare 2 hours to watch me receive my master's degree. I tapped the screen. The video loaded instantly. The bright screen illuminated the dim interior of the car, casting a pale light over my face. Chloe filled the frame, glowing with a ring light filter and a flawless professional makeup application. She was giggling, tossing her perfectly pressed silk hair over one shoulder while holding a flute of imported champagne. The background behind her was unmistakable. It was the private tasting room at an exclusive downtown steakhouse known for catering solely to the ultra-wealthy. Chloe turned the camera around, panning slowly across a long mahogany table draped in crisp white linen. The table was covered in silver platters of prime-cut steaks, grilled asparagus, and towering tiers of fresh seafood. Sitting directly across from her was her fiancé Connor, looking completely at ease in a tailored gray suit. Next to him sat his parents, older, white, and radiating that quiet generational wealth and country club money that my parents absolutely worshipped. The camera continued to pan, stopping on the 2 people who were supposed to be sitting in row G of my graduation auditorium. Vernon and Brenda were dressed to the absolute nines. My father wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit, and my mother had on a silk designer dress that easily cost more than my first car. They were laughing loudly, desperately trying to match the refined, relaxed energy of Connor parents. Vernon stood up, tapping his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp clinking sound echoed through my phone speaker, making Terrence glance over from the steering wheel with a furrowed brow. I turned the volume down slightly, but the damage was already done. Vernon raised his glass high, looking directly at Chloe and Connor with absolute adoration. "I want to make a toast," my father announced, his voice booming with that fake jovial tone he reserved strictly for people he wanted to impress. "To my beautiful daughter Chloe and her wonderful fiancé Connor. Today is a celebration of 2 incredible families coming together. I want everyone here to know that Brenda and I consider this to be the absolute most important day of the entire year. Nothing matters more than being right here, right now. The most important day of the entire year." He said those exact words exactly 45 minutes after I walked across a stage to accept a degree I had literally sacrificed my health and sanity to earn. I stared at the screen, watching my mother lean over to lovingly adjust a stray curl on Chloe's shoulder. Brenda's face was shining with a level of pure, unadulterated pride I had never once seen directed at me in my entire 35 years of life. Watching them play the perfect supportive parents for an Instagram audience made my blood run absolutely cold. It was the exact same toxic dynamic I had endured my entire life, playing out in high definition for the world to see. Chloe had always been the golden child, the flawless investment who could do no wrong. When she turned 16, Vernon and Brenda threw her a $10,000 extravaganza at a luxury hotel downtown, complete with a professional DJ, a 5-tier cake, and a custom ball gown. They paid for her out-of-state private university tuition in cash, without blinking an eye or asking for a single thank you. Meanwhile, I was the designated problem child simply because I possessed my own thoughts and refused to be their built-in servant. When I was 18, Brenda demanded I stay home from college entirely so I could be a full-time unpaid babysitter for Chloe, allowing Brenda to maintain her active social calendar of luncheons and charity galas. When I firmly refused, Vernon retaliated by declining to co-sign my student loans. He looked me dead in the eye and claimed he needed to protect his credit score so he could lease a brand new luxury sedan. I was forced to take out predatory high-interest loans that kept me drowning in financial stress for a decade. I worked 2 miserable retail jobs, mopping floors and folding clothes until midnight just to afford basic textbooks at the local community college before I finally scraped enough together to transfer to a state school. They never lifted a single finger to help me succeed. They expected me to fail so they could point at me and tell their affluent friends that I was the troubled one. Now I was a senior data analyst making 6 figures, but they still treated me like the hired help. I watched my sister clink her glass against Connor glass, sealing the toast. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes gleaming with that familiar, smug satisfaction. She knew exactly what time my graduation ceremony was. She deliberately scheduled this tasting specifically to force Vernon and Brenda to choose, and they chose her just like they always chose her. I locked my phone screen, plunging the car back into darkness. Terrence pulled into our driveway, shifting the car into park. He looked over at me, his jaw tight, and his hands gripping the steering wheel. He had heard enough of the video to know exactly what was happening, and the anger rolling off him was palpable. "You want me to drive over there?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I can go handle this right now, Jada. I will walk right into that restaurant." I looked at the beautiful house we had bought with our own hard-earned money. I looked at our amazing kids in the back seat arguing playfully over who got to carry my diploma cover inside. "No," I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "Let them enjoy their expensive steak. We have our own celebrating to do." I stepped out of the car, intentionally leaving the hurt and the rejection in the passenger seat. I absolutely refused to let them steal my joy on a day I had worked so hard for. But the silence from my family over the next few weeks was deafening. They never called to apologize. They never texted to say congratulations. They simply pretended my graduation never happened and carried on with their lives. I went back to work, carrying on with my own life, pretending their complete absence did not feel like a jagged knife in my back. Until 3 weeks later, when my phone buzzed loudly on the kitchen island and set off a chain of events that would destroy their perfect facade forever. I closed the social media application and watched my phone screen fade to black. The image of my mother and father, raising crystal glasses of expensive champagne to celebrate my sister, while my graduation seat remained completely empty, burned itself into my memory. I did not shed a single tear. I did not let my hands shake. I simply took a deep breath, smoothed the black velvet of my graduation gown, and walked out of the massive auditorium to find the people who actually wanted to celebrate my existence. Terrence was waiting for me by the main entrance with a bouquet of yellow roses. Malik and Aliyah sprinted across the crowded lobby and practically tackled me to the ground with their hugs. We celebrated my master's degree that evening at my favorite seafood restaurant, laughing until our stomachs physically hurt. I kept my phone on silent the entire night. I absolutely refused to let Vernon, Brenda, or Chloe steal one more second of my joy. The next few weeks played out exactly as I predicted. The graduation betrayal was completely swept under the rug by my parents in their usual expert fashion. 3 entire weeks slipped by without a single mention of my academic achievement. When Brenda finally called me on a random Tuesday afternoon, she did not ask how my ceremony went. She did not ask to see a photograph of me in my cap and gown. She did not even offer a belated word of congratulations. Instead, she spent 45 minutes complaining about the floral arrangements for Chloe's upcoming wedding and how difficult it was to source imported white orchids out of season. She babbled endlessly about the expectations of Connor wealthy parents and how our family needed to project a certain level of sophisticated affluence. She glossed over her absence at my graduation as if my master's degree was a minor silly hobby I had briefly entertained. I played along, giving her the short, unemotional responses I had perfected over 35 years of survival. I knew a confrontation would only end with Brenda playing the victim, weeping about how stressed she was, and Vernon calling later to lecture me about holding unnecessary grudges. I chose to maintain my peace by keeping a heavy physical and emotional distance from their circus. I thought I had successfully navigated the fallout until a quiet Thursday evening shattered my peace completely. I was sitting at my granite kitchen island, enjoying the sanctuary of my own home. Terence was upstairs reading a bedtime story to our daughter, and Malik was seated at the dining room table, sketching a project for his art class. The house smelled faintly of roasted garlic and lemon pepper chicken from the dinner we had just shared. I had my laptop open, reviewing some data sets for a new client project, feeling completely grounded and secure in the life I had built. Then my phone buzzed violently against the marble countertop. The screen illuminated, displaying a direct text message from my father. I opened the notification expecting another link to a tuxedo rental shop, or perhaps a complaint about the weather ruining his weekly golf game. Instead, I stared at a block of text that made the blood run instantly cold in my veins. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my day was going. The message read exactly like a collection notice. Chloe catering bill is short. Connor family is paying for the country club venue, so we need to step up and show we are matching their contribution. I need $6,000 transferred to my account by tonight. You owe your sister this after missing her engagement brunch last month with a bad attitude. I read the message 3 times to ensure my tired eyes were not playing tricks on me. $6,000. He wanted me to instantly hand over $6,000 of my hard-earned money to finance a luxury wedding and impress Connor White Country Club relatives. Vernon was demanding that I extort my own bank account to fund the sister who had deliberately scheduled a bridal tasting on the exact day and time of my graduation. The audacity of his reasoning was almost staggering. He had the nerve to drag up Chloe's engagement brunch as a weapon of guilt. I had missed that brunch because I was locked in a university library, taking the final exams that earned the very degree they ignored. I had respectfully declined the brunch invitation weeks in advance, apologizing and explaining my academic conflict. Yet in Vernon, twisted reality, prioritizing my education was viewed as having a bad attitude, while completely abandoning his eldest daughter on her graduation day was simply business as usual. I stared at the glowing screen, analyzing the psychology behind his demand. Vernon was deeply intimidated by Connor's father, who was a highly successful investment banker. Vernon wanted to play the role of a wealthy real estate mogul. He wanted to project the image of a man who could easily drop tens of thousands of dollars on imported champagne and premium catering. But Vernon was broke. He had always been terrible with money, preferring to buy depreciating assets like leased luxury cars and expensive country club memberships rather than building actual wealth. He wanted to use my six-figure tech salary to mask his own financial inadequacy. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a convenient ATM machine ready to dispense cash to save his fragile ego. A profound shift occurred deep inside my brain at that exact moment. The old Jada would have felt a crushing wave of conditioned guilt. The old Jada would have felt her heart race with anxiety, terrified of displeasing her father. The old Jada would have immediately drafted a massive defensive paragraph, explaining my feelings, begging for a shred of validation, pointing out the blatant hypocrisy of his demand. But I was no longer that frightened little girl, seeking approval from people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I was a senior data analyst, I dealt in facts, logic, and precise execution. I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not waste my breath typing out an emotional essay that Vernon would only mock and disregard. I calmly closed out of the text message thread and opened my mobile banking application. The biometric scanner read my face and unlocked my account. I navigated smoothly to the quick transfer portal and selected Vernon contact name from my list of saved recipients. The application prompted me to enter the transfer amount. My finger hovered over the digital keypad. I pressed the number 6 followed by a decimal point and 2 zeros. I stared at the screen verifying the amount. Exactly $6. I scrolled down to the memo line. The bank allowed a brief message to accompany the funds. I tapped the screen and typed two simple definitive words: best wishes. I reviewed the transaction one final time. I felt a profound, quiet satisfaction wash over my entire body. I was officially resigning from my unpaid position as the family's scapegoat and financial safety net. I firmly pressed the send button. The screen flashed green, confirming the money had been instantly transferred to Vernon account. I set my phone face down on the kitchen island and picked up my mug of herbal tea, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Less than 3 seconds later, my phone vibrated with a violent, continuous buzzing that rattled against the marble counter. I flipped the device over, expecting a barrage of confused text messages. Vernon had not replied with a text. He had bypassed the keyboard entirely and sent a direct audio voice note. I tapped the play button, turning the media volume all the way up just as Terrence walked down the stairs and into the kitchen. Vernon's deep, furious voice blasted through the phone speaker, echoing sharply off the kitchen walls. He was practically spitting his words into the microphone, his tone thick with an ugly, unhinged rage. You have always been a selfish, jealous little girl. If you want to play games with family money, we are coming over to collect what you owe right now. The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the center of our living room. I set my phone down on the smooth glass of the coffee table, my hand surprisingly steady, despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. Across the sofa, Terrence had completely frozen. He slowly lowered his evening reading to his lap, while pushing his wire-framed reading glasses up into his hair. He stared at the dark screen of my phone as if it were a live, explosive device sitting in our home. We had just spent the last 2 exhausting hours unpacking the absolute emotional devastation of my graduation day, trying to make sense of the 5 empty premium seats. Now this. Terrence let out a slow, measured breath, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, his jaw pulling tight with that quiet, protective anger he reserved specifically for my family. Vernon would not care. Terrence said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble that usually calmed my nerves. He is just blowing off steam because you finally called his bluff and hit his pride where it hurts. He knows better than to show up at our house demanding cash like some kind of neighborhood mob boss. I wanted desperately to believe him. I wanted to sink back into the plush cushions of my sofa and let the safety of our home wash over me. Our house was our ultimate sanctuary. We had spent years turning this space into a peaceful haven, entirely separate from the toxic, exhausting demands of my parents. The faint scent of lavender and the quiet hum of the central heating usually signaled that I was safe. But a cold, creeping sense of dread started crawling up the back of my neck, settling heavily at the base of my spine. I knew my father far better than Terrence did. Vernon did not make empty threats when his fragile ego and his empty wallet were on the line. He especially did not make empty threats when he was desperately trying to impress country club money. Before I could even open my mouth to agree with my husband, a sharp, heavy metallic click echoed from the front hallway. The sound was unmistakable and entirely out of place at this hour of the night. It was the heavy brass deadbolt of our front door, turning smoothly from the outside. Terrence and I both froze our eyes, locking in a moment of sheer confusion. We did not have any expected guests. The kids were already upstairs, safely tucked away for the night. Then the horrific realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. 3 years ago, during a terrifying winter storm, Malik had suffered a severe asthma attack. We had to rush him to the pediatric emergency room in the dead of night. In my absolute panic, I had called my mother and handed her an emergency spare key, begging her to come to the house, grab Malik medical records, and pack an overnight bag for us. It was a rare moment of sheer desperation where I actually trusted them to help. When the dust settled and Malik was safe, I had completely forgotten to ask for the key back. They never came over. Our house was far too modest for their extravagant tastes, so they simply stayed away, treating our neighborhood like a foreign country. I had foolishly believed the key was lost in the bottom of Brenda's designer purse. Instead, they had kept it. They had kept my emergency key and weaponized it to breach my sanctuary. The heavy wooden front door swung inward, hitting the hallway wall, stop with a violent, aggressive thud. Heavy, uninvited footsteps slapped loudly against the polished hardwood floor of our foyer. Vernon, Brenda, and Chloe marched directly into my living room, moving with the coordinated hostility of a military raid. They did not ring the doorbell. They did not knock. They did not announce themselves. They simply invaded the safe space I had worked so hard to build. Vernon was leading the charge. He was still wearing the expensive custom-tailored gray suit he had loudly bragged about buying specifically for my graduation. His face was flushed a dark mottled red with pure, unadulterated fury. His eyes were wide and fixed entirely on me, ignoring the fact that he had just trespassed into another man's home. Brenda marched right beside him, moving in perfect lockstep. Her expensive leather designer purse was clutched tightly under her arm like a shield, and her lips were pressed into a thin white line of absolute disapproval. Chloe trailed slightly behind them, crossing her arms over her chest and wearing a petulant theatrical scowl, as if my very existence was a personal insult to her bridal joy. They stood there in the center of my living room, tracking outside dirt onto my clean woven rugs, bringing the exact toxic chaos I had tried so hard to escape right into my home. As they fanned out across the living room floor, my eyes darted past Vernon, aggressive posture toward the large bay window facing the front yard. The blinds were partially open, allowing me a clear view of the driveway, illuminated by the amber glow of the streetlights. Parked right behind Terrence's SUV, blocking us in completely, was a brand new gleaming white BMW. The engine was still running, throwing a soft, continuous cloud of exhaust into the cool night air. Sitting in the driver's seat, his face illuminated by the bright glowing screen of his smartphone, was Connor. He was casually scrolling through social media, completely and utterly oblivious to the hostile home invasion his future in-laws were currently executing just 30 feet away. Looking at him sitting out there in the plush leather seat of his leased luxury car, I felt a sharp, sudden pang of cynical clarity. The entire picture crystallized in my mind. Connor came from old generational wealth. His family name carried weight in elite financial circles. They belonged to exclusive tennis clubs, spent their winters skiing in the Swiss Alps, and casually debated offshore investment strategies. Connor genuinely believed he was marrying into a family of equal financial standing. For the past 2 years, Vernon and Brenda had spent every waking moment bending over backward to maintain the grand illusion that they were affluent, successful real estate moguls. They leased luxury vehicles they absolutely could not afford on paper. They bought designer clothes on a revolving carousel of maxed-out credit cards, and they hosted lavish catered dinners to keep up appearances and stroke their own vanity. Connor had absolutely no idea that the people he was about to call family were financially drowning. He had no clue that the wealthy father of the bride was currently storming through his eldest daughter's living room, demanding a $6,000 ransom just to cover a catering bill he could not actually afford to pay. Vernon and Brenda had purposely left Connor in the running car to hide their shameful extortion. They needed his family money and the prestige of the Thornton name far too badly to risk him witnessing this pathetic, desperate display of financial ruin. They needed to shake me down for cash behind closed doors, so they could walk back out to the BMW smiling and pretending they were just dropping off a wedding invitation. Vernon took another aggressive step forward, closing the distance between us and pulling my attention back to the living room. He pointed a thick, rigid finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the fact that Terrence had immediately stood up from the sofa, his massive frame blocking the path to where I sat. "You think you are funny?" Vernon spat out, his voice vibrating with a ragged, ugly anger that filled the room. You think sending me $6 is some kind of cute joke? You think you can embarrass me while I am trying to finalize the most important details for your sister wedding? I remained seated on the sofa, forcing my breathing to stay steady and my hands to remain perfectly still in my lap. I absolutely refused to cower in my own home. I refused to let them see me sweat. I did not send you a joke, Dad, I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of the emotion he was trying to provoke. You sent me a text demanding $6,000 for a party I was not invited to plan. I sent you what I felt I owed you, exactly $6 and my best wishes for the happy couple. Brenda stepped forward, pushing past Vernon's shoulder to launch her own coordinated attack. She threw her hands up dramatically, her heavy gold bracelets clanking loudly together in the quiet room. How can you be so incredibly selfish? Jada, Brenda yelled, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. Your sister is marrying into a very important, prominent family. The Thorntons are paying for the entire country club venue without asking for a single dime. They expect us to step up and handle the luxury catering and the imported floral arrangements. We are already stretched thin, making sure everything is absolutely perfect and flawless for Connor parents. And you have the sheer nerve to play petty games with us when we ask for a tiny bit of family help. A tiny bit of family help, I repeated softly, staring at the woman who had not even bothered to send a single text message congratulating me on the master degree I had received just hours ago. $6,000 is not a tiny bit of help, Brenda. It is a shakedown, and it is certainly not my financial responsibility to fund a luxury wedding I am barely even involved in. You are involved! Chloe shrieked, suddenly stepping out from behind our mother. Her face was twisted into a dramatic mask of pure victimhood, her voice pitching upward into a whine. You are my sister Jada. You are supposed to be happy for me. But you have been acting like a jealous, bitter loser ever since Connor proposed. You skipped my engagement brunch. You refused to go dress shopping with me, and now you are trying to humiliate Dad when he is just trying to give me the wedding I deserve. You are trying to ruin my life just because you are miserable. I felt the last remaining shred of my patience, the tiny fraction of grace I had been holding on to all the evening, snap clean in half. The sheer audacity of them standing in my living room, weaponizing my boundaries against me, was the absolute final straw. I stood up slowly, my eyes bypassing my parents and locking directly onto my sister. I skipped your engagement brunch because I was locked in a library taking the final exams for the master degree. You all conveniently forgot about today, I said, my voice dropping an octave, the cold truth ringing through the room. The degree I earned while working full-time and raising 2 children. The degree I received on a stage this afternoon while looking down at 5 empty premium front row seats. My words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I watched the cold truth wash over them, but instead of offering an apology or even displaying a fleeting flicker of shame, Brenda simply swatted my pain away like a bothersome insect. She pushed past Vernon's shoulder, her heavy gold bracelets clanking loudly together as she marched directly into my personal space. She thrust her perfectly manicured acrylic nail right toward my face, her eyes wide with a frantic entitlement. You are embarrassing us in front of Connor people, Brenda screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings of my living room. You know exactly what is at stake here, Jada. Connor family has generational wealth. They belong to legacy country clubs. They have incredibly high expectations. We absolutely cannot look like we are struggling to cover a simple catering bill while they are dropping $50,000 on the venue without batting a single eye. She paced back and forth across my woven rug, wildly gesturing with her hands, as if she were the victim of a great injustice. Give your sister the $6,000, Jada. You sit at a desk analyzing data all day and collect a massive paycheck while your sister is out here trying to build a proper network. You have the money sitting right there in your bank account gathering dust. I see the expensive computer servers in your home office. I see the designer suits you wear to work. You are just holding the cash hostage to be vindictive and spiteful. You are deliberately trying to humiliate your own flesh and blood over some silly little college ceremony. A silly little college ceremony. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. She had just reduced half a decade of sleepless nights and grueling academic labor to a trivial inconvenience that was getting in the way of her social climbing. Brenda did not care that I had achieved a master's degree in data analytics. She only cared that my salary could be used as a personal slush fund to prop up the grand financial illusion she was selling to the Thornton family. She actually expected me to cheerfully finance the very people who had abandoned me just hours prior. I looked past her shoulder toward the bay window. Connor was still sitting out there in the idling BMW scrolling on his phone, completely ignorant to the fact that his future in-laws were currently attempting to extort $6,000 from me just to keep their heads above water. Seeing that Brenda's demanding approach was not making me flinch, Chloe decided it was time to switch tactics. She deployed her ultimate weapon, the fake tears. Chloe's lower lip began to tremble and her eyes filled with perfectly timed crystalline pools of water. She clutched the fabric of her expensive silk blouse and let out a dramatic wounded sob that sounded like a dying animal. "You are doing this on purpose," Chloe cried, her voice wavering with practiced fragility. "You are trying to sabotage my wedding because you are horribly jealous of me, Jada. You have always been jealous of me." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that bounced off the living room walls. "Jealous of you? What exactly is there to be jealous of, Chloe? You do not have a job. You do not have a savings account. You are currently standing in my house trying to rob me to pay for a party you cannot afford." Chloe's face twisted from faux sadness into pure venomous spite, her tears instantly vanishing. "You are jealous because Connor family actually has class." She spat out, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You are trying to ruin my elegant five-star wedding because your own wedding was nothing but a cheap, pathetic backyard barbecue. You served hot dogs and potato salad on paper plates, Jada. You bought beer in cheap plastic coolers and made everyone stand in the grass. It was incredibly embarrassing for the family. Our relatives still talk about how tacky it was. You are just bitter that my wedding is going to be a luxury high society event, while yours looked like a neighborhood block party. So you are holding back the catering money to punish me." The sheer audacity of her insults sucked all the oxygen right out of the room. I felt Terrence shift his weight behind me, his protective instincts flaring up at the massive disrespect. Our wedding had been hosted right here in our own backyard. We had strung up beautiful fairy lights, we hired a local jazz band to play on the patio, and we served incredible soul food catered by a local family-owned restaurant. It was intimate, it was gorgeous, and it was filled with genuine, pure love. But to Chloe and my parents, it was an embarrassing failure simply because it lacked a pretentious country club address and a valet parking attendant. They had complained about my wedding for 6 solid years, making snide, passive-aggressive remarks at every single holiday dinner about how they wished I had allowed them to invite their wealthy friends to a proper venue. They had pushed the exact wrong button. The restraint I had been practicing all evening evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold surgical precision. I stepped around the coffee table, closing the distance between Chloe and me until we were standing mere inches apart. I looked directly into her widening eyes and stripped away the ugly family secret we had all been quietly ignoring for 6 long years. "My wedding was a backyard barbecue, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that forced everyone in the room to lean in and listen closely. "My wedding was a backyard barbecue because Dad stole my $5,000 venue deposit to bail you out of a wrecked car settlement." The living room went dead silent. The fake tears instantly dried up on Chloe's face, leaving behind a mask of pure terror. Vernon took a sharp intake of breath, his face draining of its angry red color and turning a sickly pale gray. I did not stop. I weaponized the past and drove it straight into the center of the present argument. I had saved that $5,000 working double shifts at the retail store while finishing my undergraduate degree. I continued, raising my voice so it echoed clearly off the hardwood floors. I entrusted that cash to Dad to hand-deliver to the estate venue because he insisted on handling the vendor contracts to help out. But he never paid the venue, did he, Chloe? He took my wedding money, and he secretly handed it straight to you. Because you decided to drive drunk after a sorority party, and you crashed your car into a parked minivan. Brenda opened her mouth to interject, but I held up my hand, slicing through the air and silencing her instantly. "Do not even try to deny it, Brenda. I know exactly what happened. The owner of that minivan threatened to press criminal charges and ruin Chloe's pristine reputation. So Vernon took my $5,000 wedding deposit and used it as a cash payoff to settle the damages out of court and keep his golden child out of a jail cell. Terrence and I had to sit down at our kitchen table and call every single one of our guests 3 weeks before the wedding to tell them the location had changed. We had to swallow our pride and pretend we wanted a casual outdoor setting, while I cried myself to sleep every night over the estate venue I had dreamed about since I was a little girl. We had to scramble to host a backyard barbecue because my own father robbed me blind to save you from the consequences of your own reckless actions. I watched Chloe swallow hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the front window where Connor was still waiting in the car. The absolute last thing she wanted was for Connor to find out about her secret illegal settlement. And the best part, I added, stepping even closer to my father, forcing him to look me in the eye. You never paid me back. You looked me in the eye at my backyard barbecue while eating the food Terrence paid for, and you told me that family helps family. You told me to keep it a secret to protect Chloe's future. You stole $5,000 from me, Vernon. So when you texted me demanding $6,000 tonight, I figured giving you $6 meant we were finally even. Vernon's hands curled into tight fists at his sides. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He was trapped, and he knew it. He could not deny the truth because the truth was standing right in front of him, armed with years of suppressed receipts. But instead of apologizing, instead of experiencing a single moment of genuine remorse for ruining my wedding to save Chloe, his towering pride demanded that he double down. He refused to look at Terrence. He focused all his aggressive energy squarely on me, the daughter he thought he could bully into submission. You are my daughter, Vernon growled, taking a threatening step forward. His chest puffed out like a cornered animal. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. Everything you have is because of the foundation I built. You owe us that money, and I am not leaving this house until you pay it. Vernon's chest heaved as he stood in the center of my living room, completely unbothered by the fact that I had just exposed his criminal theft. He did not possess the emotional capacity to feel shame or remorse. In his distorted reality, taking my money to save his golden child was simply an executive decision he was entitled to make. He sneered, his eyes darting around the room, evaluating my belongings like a repo man assessing assets. He looked past me, his gaze locking onto the open doorway of my home office down the hall, where the blinking blue lights of my high-capacity data servers hummed quietly. Then he glanced toward the mudroom, spotting the custom leather golf bag Terrence had just purchased last month. You think you can withhold what belongs to this family? Vernon snarled, taking a heavy, aggressive step toward the hallway. You sit in this nice little house acting like you are better than us. If you refuse to transfer that cash, I will take it out in trade. I know exactly what those computer servers cost Jada. I know what Terrence paid for those golf clubs. I will load them into the trunk of my car right now and hold them as collateral until you stop acting like a spoiled brat and pay your sister catering bill. He actually lunged forward, extending his thick arms, fully intending to muscle his way past me and ransack my home. Before Vernon could take a second step, a wall of solid muscle materialized directly in his path. Terrence moved with a terrifying, silent speed. My husband is not a loud man. He is patient, kind, and possesses a deep, steady grace that usually anchors my chaotic family interactions. For the 10 years we had been married, Terrence had swallowed his tongue, maintaining a polite, respectful smile, while Vernon and Brenda made passive-aggressive digs at our lifestyle. He had played the role of the dutiful son-in-law to keep the peace. That polite smile was completely gone. Terrence planted his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, his broad shoulders filling the width of the hallway. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at Vernon. The physical difference between the two men was suddenly glaringly obvious. Vernon was loud, soft, and running on the panicked adrenaline of a broke man trying to save face. Terrence was a former college linebacker, rigid, calm, and absolutely lethal in his stillness. Take one more step toward my wife's office, Terrence said. His voice did not raise above a conversational volume, but the sheer freezing gravity of his tone made the entire room drop 10 degrees. Take one more step into my house, Vernon, and I promise you will not walk out of it on your own 2 feet. Vernon froze, his face inches from Terrence's chest. He blinked, clearly shocked that the normally docile husband was actively threatening him. Excuse me, Vernon sputtered, trying to maintain his aggressive posture. Do not disrespect me in front of my family. I am your father-in-law. You are a trespasser. Terrence corrected his voice, a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the air. You broke into my home. You threatened my wife. You threatened to steal my property. You lost the title of father-in-law the second you walked through that door to extort the woman I love. Brenda let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching her designer purse to her chest. Terrence, how dare you speak to him that way? We are family. Terrence slowly shifted his dark, unblinking gaze to Brenda, silencing her instantly. Then he looked back down at Vernon, leaning in slightly so his words would carry absolute clarity. I am giving you exactly 10 seconds to turn around and vacate my premises, Terrence commanded, his jaw locked tight. If you are still standing on my hardwood floor at the end of those 10 seconds, I will physically pick you up, carry you out the front door, and throw you face first onto the concrete driveway, right in front of Connor's shiny new BMW. And I will gladly tell that young man exactly why his future in-laws are begging for loose change in the middle of the night. 10. Vernon's mouth opened and closed, completely devoid of words. He looked at Terrence's clenched fists, then glanced nervously toward the front bay window where Connor was still blissfully scrolling on his phone in the idling car. The absolute last thing Vernon could afford was a physical altercation on the front lawn that exposed his financial ruin to the Thornton family. The grand illusion would be shattered instantly. 9, Terrence counted, taking one slow, deliberate half-step forward. The fight drained out of Vernon like a deflating balloon. The tough guy facade crumbled, leaving behind a pathetic, desperate man who realized he had severely overplayed his hand. He took a hasty step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the woven area rug. 8. You are both dead to us, Brenda shrieked, backing toward the front door, her face a mask of furious humiliation. Do not bother showing up to the wedding. Do not call us. You are entirely cut off from this family. 7, Terrence counted, completely ignoring her theatrical disownment. Chloe grabbed Brenda's arm, pulling her toward the exit. She was terrified that Terrence's countdown would end, and Connor would witness her father being bodily tossed into the street. Let us go, Mom. They are psychotic. Connor is going to wonder what is taking so long. Vernon practically scrambled backward, retreating through the foyer. He grabbed the doorknob, his chest heaving with defeated rage. You will regret this, Jada, he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me from the safety of the threshold. You just burned your only bridge. Close the door on your way out, I replied, my voice perfectly steady. Vernon slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind them. The house shook with the force of the impact, and then total silence returned to our living room. Through the window blinds, Terrence and I watched as Vernon, Brenda, and Chloe hurried across the lawn. They forced bright, relaxed smiles onto their faces the second they approached the BMW. Connor rolled down his window, completely unaware of the extortion attempt that had just failed spectacularly. Vernon leaned in, said something jovial, and gave a hearty wave before they all piled into Brenda Least's sedan and sped off into the night. The heavy adrenaline that had been keeping me upright suddenly washed away, leaving my knees weak. I leaned against the kitchen island, letting out a long, shaky breath. Terrence turned around his shoulders, dropping as the tension left his body. He walked over and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight, grounding embrace. I rested my forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. We did not need to have a long, drawn-out conversation about what had just transpired. We both understood the gravity of the line that had been permanently crossed. They had weaponized my past, invaded my sanctuary, and threatened to steal our property. There was absolutely no coming back from this, and frankly, I did not want to. I pulled away from Terrence, reached onto the counter, and handed him my cell phone. Call an emergency locksmith, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute finality. I do not care what the late-night surcharge costs. Pay double if you have to. I want every single exterior lock on this house changed immediately. Terrence nodded, taking the phone without a single word of debate. Within 45 minutes, a commercial locksmith van pulled into our driveway. We paid an exorbitant fee to have heavy-duty high-security deadbolts installed on the front door, the back patio, and the side garage entrance. I stood in the foyer watching the technicians swap out the brass hardware, feeling a profound psychological shift with every turn of his screwdriver. The physical changing of the locks represented the permanent closing of a door I had left cracked open for far too long. They could no longer breach my sanctuary. By the time the locksmith departed, the clock was nearing midnight. The intense emotional labor of the evening had left both Terence and me deeply exhausted. We walked upstairs together, checking on Malik and Aliyah. They were both sound asleep, completely undisturbed by the chaotic intrusion that had occurred just downstairs. I pulled Malik's blanket up to his shoulders and gently brushed a stray curl away from Aliyah's face. Looking at my beautiful, peaceful children, my resolve hardened into steel. I would never allow my parents' toxic dysfunction to bleed into their lives. The cycle officially stopped with me. Terence and I walked back downstairs to the living room, ready to finally exhale and reclaim the peace of our evening. I moved toward the kitchen to pour a fresh cup of tea, letting my shoulders drop, believing the nightmare of the day was definitively over. Suddenly, a series of heavy, authoritative pounds rattled our brand new front door. The impacts were aggressive, demanding immediate entry. The sound echoed violently through the quiet house, making me jump backward. Before Terence could even reach the foyer, a harsh, pulsating combination of red and blue lights began flashing violently through our living room blinds, casting chaotic, sweeping shadows across the walls. The heavy, authoritative pounding against our brand new front door sent a shockwave through the quiet house. The impacts were aggressive and demanding, completely lacking the hesitation of a late-night visitor. Red and blue strokes sliced violently through the narrow gaps in our living room blinds, casting manic, sweeping shadows across the freshly painted walls. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind instantly snapped into a state of hyper-focused clarity. Terence and I exchanged a single silent look. The warmth and relief we had felt just moments ago evaporated completely. Terence moved first, striding purposefully toward the foyer with his broad shoulders squared. I followed a half-step behind him, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. He reached for the newly installed high-security deadbolt, turning the heavy brass latch with a sharp metallic clack. He pulled the door open, revealing the absolute last thing I expected to see on my front porch. 2 uniformed police officers stood squarely on our welcome mat. Their hands rested casually, but purposefully, near their utility belts. Beyond their broad shoulders, my manicured front lawn was illuminated by the harsh flashing lights of a marked patrol cruiser parked haphazardly blocking our driveway. And standing safely behind the 2 officers entirely shielded by their authority was Vernon. The physical transformation my father had undergone in the span of an hour was nothing short of a theatrical masterpiece. The aggressive, red-faced bully, who had just tried to physically muscle his way into my home office, was completely gone. In his place stood a fragile, trembling old man. Vernon had actually hunched his shoulders forward, making himself appear smaller and weaker. He was clutching the lapels of his expensive, custom-tailored gray suit with shaking hands. His eyes were wide and watery, darting around nervously, as if he were genuinely terrified of his own daughter. He was playing the role of the distressed elderly victim to absolute perfection. "Good evening, sir," the older officer said, directing his attention immediately to Terence. His voice was stern, carrying that unmistakable tone of practiced authority. "We received an emergency dispatch call from this gentleman claiming a domestic dispute and grand larceny at this residence. Are you the homeowners?" Terence did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He knew exactly how precarious the situation was, and he navigated the inherent tension of standing on his own porch, dealing with armed officers, with an absolute flawless calm. He kept his hands entirely visible, resting them lightly against the doorframe. "Yes, Officer," Terence replied, his voice a deep, steady rumble that projected complete cooperation and zero intimidation. "My wife and I own this property. There is no domestic dispute occurring here. We were simply putting our children to bed." The younger officer shifted his weight, shining a high-powered flashlight past Terrence's shoulder to quickly sweep the interior of our foyer. "The gentleman behind us claims otherwise," the younger officer stated. "He states that he is your father-in-law. He reported that he came over this evening to retrieve specific family property and that he was violently thrown out of the house. He states that you subsequently changed the locks to secure the stolen property inside. I stepped out from behind Terrence, moving directly into the harsh glare of the porch light. I pulled the heavy wooden front door shut behind me until it clicked securely into the frame, legally denying them any visual or physical access to the interior of my sanctuary. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my husband, staring blankly at the man who had donated his DNA to me. "What exactly is my father claiming I stole?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat and analytical. Vernon let out a pathetic, wavering gasp, stepping out slightly from behind the older officer. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted into a mask of manufactured grief. "She has my mother jewelry," Vernon cried, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "She has the vintage diamond brooches and the estate pearl necklaces that belonged to my late mother. They are family heirlooms meant for my youngest daughter Chloe to wear at her upcoming wedding. I came over to peacefully collect them, and they threatened my life. They locked me out to keep the diamonds. I demand that you search the premises immediately, officers. She is holding my family legacy hostage in there." The sheer magnitude of the lie hung in the cool night air. Vernon was not just trying to extort $6,000 from me anymore. He was actively attempting to weaponize the criminal justice system to punish me for closing my bank account to him. He was willing to have me arrested in front of my own children to save his fragile ego. The older officer turned back to me, his posture stiffening slightly. "Ma'am, we take allegations of grand larceny very seriously. The items described hold significant financial and sentimental value. We need to step inside and conduct a preliminary search of the premises to verify the location of the property in question." "No, officer," I replied smoothly without a single trace of hesitation. "You absolutely may not enter my home. You do not have a search warrant, and my father is currently committing a crime while standing right behind you by filing a false police report." Vernon let out a loud theatrical sob, clutching his chest. "She is lying. She is a thief. Do not let her get away with this." I ignored his performance entirely, locking my gaze onto the older officer. "My father does not have any vintage diamond brooches or estate pearls to give to my sister," I stated, surgically dismantling the foundation of his lie. "I know this for an absolute verifiable fact because I am a senior data analyst. 5 years ago, my father begged me to audit his personal business accounts because he was facing a massive margin call on a failed commercial real estate flip. He was drowning in debt and terrified of bankruptcy." The trembling instantly stopped in Vernon's hands. The fake tears dried up. The hunched posture began to straighten as the reality of what I was saying hit him. While I was balancing his fraudulent ledgers, I discovered a massive gap in his assets. I continued, my voice ringing out clearly across the quiet suburban street. "So I know exactly what happened to my grandmother jewelry. My father took those heirlooms to the Gold Exchange pawn shop on 8th Avenue on November 14th, exactly 5 years ago. He pawned his own mother legacy for $14,000 in cold, hard cash just to keep his leased luxury vehicles from being repossessed." The younger officer lowered his flashlight, his brow furrowing as he looked back and forth between me and Vernon. "If you would like to wait right here on the porch, officer, I am more than happy to retrieve my work laptop," I offered, maintaining direct eye contact. "I still have the digital copies of the pawnshop receipts and the corresponding bank deposits saved in a secure encrypted file. I can print them out for you right now so you can attach them to the police report for filing false charges against me." The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and palpable. The two officers who had arrived ready to intervene in a major theft suddenly realized they had been manipulated into playing the role of armed debt collectors for a desperate liar. The older officer turned slowly on his heel, facing my father. The professional courtesy completely vanished from his stance. "Sir," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave and hardening into stone, "is what your daughter just stated true? Did you pawn the items you just reported stolen to my dispatch unit?" Vernon opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face cycled rapidly through a spectrum of colors, settling on a sickly pale white. He looked at the two armed officers who were now glaring at him with undisguised irritation. He looked at Terrence, who was standing like a monolithic wall of silent protection. And finally he looked at me, realizing that the daughter he used to bully was now holding the match to burn his entire remaining reputation to ashes. It was a misunderstanding. Vernon finally choked out, taking a hasty step backward toward the driveway. I must have been mistaken about the current location of the items. Grief makes you forget things. I will just be leaving now. He turned to rush toward his car, but the younger officer stepped directly into his path, blocking his escape. "Hold on a minute, sir," the younger officer demanded, unhooking the radio from his shoulder. "You do not get to call in a grand larceny claim dispatch, two municipal units tie up emergency resources, and then just walk away claiming a misunderstanding when you get caught in a lie." I stepped forward slightly, resting my hand on Terrence's arm. "Officers," I said, drawing their attention back to the porch. "My husband and I do not wish to press formal charges for the false report tonight. We simply want to go back to sleep. However, I would like to formally request that you officially trespass this man from our property. I want it on the legal record that Vernon is no longer permitted to step foot on this lawn, approach this house, or contact us at this residence ever again." The older officer nodded firmly, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. "Consider it done." He turned his stern gaze back to my father. "You heard the homeowner, sir. You are officially trespassed from this address. If you return to this property for any reason, including retrieving imaginary jewelry, you will be immediately arrested and booked for criminal trespassing. Do you understand these terms?" Vernon stood frozen on my front walkway, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights. The prestigious, wealthy facade he had spent decades meticulously crafting was lying in shattered pieces around his expensive leather shoes. He gave a single stiff nod of his head, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Without looking at me again, Vernon turned and practically jogged down the driveway toward his car. The two officers followed closely behind him, ensuring he got into his vehicle and actually vacated the neighborhood. Terrence and I stood on the porch watching the red taillights of Vernon's car disappear around the corner, followed shortly by the police cruiser. The flashing lights finally faded, leaving our street bathed in the quiet, peaceful glow of the amber street lamps. The heavy, suffocating presence of my family was completely purged from the premises. We had drawn the ultimate boundary and enforced it with absolute prejudice. Terrence wrapped his heavy arm around my shoulders, pulling me close to his side. The cool night wind brushed past us, but I did not feel the chill. I felt an incredible soaring warmth blooming in my chest. "Come on," Terrence murmured, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. "Let us go back inside and lock our new doors. We have a peaceful life to get back to." Vernon did not wait for my response. His towering pride, completely immune to the devastating truth I had just laid bare, demanded immediate retaliation. He scoffed a disgusting sound of pure, unadulterated entitlement and turned his back on me. With heavy stomping footsteps, he marched directly past the kitchen island and headed straight for the hallway leading to my home office. My home office was my sanctuary, the physical manifestation of my hard-won independence. Through the open doorway, the soft blue LED lights of my high-end data servers blinked rhythmically in the dim room. Those servers represented years of grueling corporate analytics, late-night coding sessions, and the financial stability I had built entirely on my own. Next to the office door, resting in the mudroom alcove, was Terrence's prized possession, a custom-fitted set of professional golf clubs, housed in a heavy leather bag. "You think you can withhold what belongs to this family?" Vernon snarled, his eyes darting frantically between the expensive computer equipment and the golf bag. "If you refuse to transfer that cash, I will take it out in trade. I know exactly what those servers cost, Jada. I know what your husband paid for those clubs. I will load every single piece of it into the trunk of my car right now. I will hold it as collateral until you stop acting like a spoiled, ungrateful brat and pay your sister's catering bill." The sheer audacity of his threat temporarily paralyzed me. He was actively planning to rob my home to finance an illusion for his golden child. He reached out his thick, manicured fingers, extending toward the leather strap of Terrence's golf bag, fully intending to muscle his way through my house and drag our property out the front door. Before Vernon's fingers could even brush the leather, a wall of solid muscle materialized directly in his path. Terrence moved with a terrifying, silent speed. For the entire decade we had been married, my husband had been the anchor of our chaotic family interactions. He was patient, deeply kind, and possessed a steady grace that I constantly relied upon. He had swallowed his tongue countless times, maintaining a polite, respectful smile, while Vernon and Brenda made passive-aggressive digs at our lifestyle, our wedding, and our choices. He had played the role of the dutiful, accommodating son-in-law, solely to keep the peace and protect my feelings. That polite smile was completely gone. Terence planted his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, his broad shoulders entirely blocking the width of the hallway. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at Vernon from his 6'3" vantage point. The physical disparity between the two men was suddenly glaringly obvious. Vernon was loud, soft around the middle, and running entirely on the panicked adrenaline of a desperate man trying to save face. Terence was a former collegiate linebacker, rigid, calm, and absolutely lethal in his stillness. "Take one more step toward my wife's office," Terence said. His voice did not raise above a normal conversational volume, but the sheer freezing gravity of his tone made the temperature in the living room plummet. "Take one single step further into my house, Vernon, and I promise you will not walk out of it on your own 2 feet." Vernon froze, his outstretched hand hovering uselessly in the air mere inches from Terence's chest. He blinked rapidly, clearly shocked that the normally docile son-in-law was actively threatening him. "Excuse me," Vernon sputtered, his face flushing a deep, angry purple as he tried to maintain his aggressive posture. "Do not disrespect me in my daughter's house. I am your father-in-law. Step aside, boy." "You are a trespasser," Terence corrected, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the silent house. "You broke the peace of my home. You threatened my wife. You explicitly threatened to steal my property. You lost the title of father-in-law the absolute second you walked through that front door to extort the woman I love." Brenda let out a high-pitched, theatrical gasp from the living room, clutching her designer purse to her chest as if she were witnessing a murder. "Terence, how dare you speak to him that way? We are your family." Terence slowly shifted his dark, unblinking gaze to Brenda, silencing her instantly with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. Then he looked back down at Vernon, leaning in slightly so his words would carry absolute, undeniable clarity. "I am giving you exactly 10 seconds to turn around and vacate my premises," Terence commanded, his jaw locked tight, every muscle in his neck standing out in sharp relief. "If you are still standing on my hardwood floor at the end of those 10 seconds, I will physically pick you up, carry you out the front door, and throw you face first onto the concrete driveway right in front of Connor's shiny new BMW. And I will gladly tell that young man exactly why his future in-laws are begging for loose change in the middle of the night." 10. Vernon's mouth opened and closed, completely devoid of words. The bluster evaporated. He looked at Terence's clenched fists, then glanced nervously toward the front bay window where Connor was still blissfully waiting in the idling car. The absolute last thing Vernon could afford was a physical altercation on the front lawn that exposed his financial ruin and criminal behavior to the wealthy Thornton family. The grand illusion he had sacrificed my wedding to protect would be shattered instantly. 9, Terence counted, taking one slow, deliberate half-step forward. The fight drained out of Vernon like a deflated balloon. The tough guy facade crumbled into dust, leaving behind a pathetic, desperate man who realized he had severely overplayed his hand. He took a hasty step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes. 8. "You are both dead to us," Brenda shrieked, backing toward the front foyer, her face a mask of furious humiliation. "Do not bother showing up to the wedding. Do not call us. You are entirely cut off from this family. You will never see a dime of our estate." 7. Terence counted, completely ignoring her hollow threats. Chloe grabbed Brenda's arm, yanking her toward the exit. She was terrified that Terence's countdown would end, and Connor would witness her father being bodily tossed into the street like common trash. "Let us go, Mom. They are psychotic. Connor is going to wonder what is taking so long. Just leave them." Vernon practically scrambled backward, retreating through the foyer. He grabbed the brass doorknob, his chest heaving with defeated rage. "You will regret this, Jada," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me from the safety of the threshold. "You just burned your only bridge." "Close the door on your way out," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, mirroring my husband's unyielding strength. Vernon slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind them. The house shook with the force of the impact, and then a blessed total silence returned to our living room. Through the window blinds, Terrence and I watched as Vernon, Brenda, and Chloe hurried across the lawn. They forced bright, relaxed smiles onto their faces the second they approached the BMW. Connor rolled down his window, completely unaware of the extortion attempt that had just failed spectacularly. Vernon leaned in, said something jovial, and gave a hearty wave before they all piled into Brenda's leased sedan and sped off into the night. The heavy adrenaline that had been keeping me upright suddenly washed away, leaving my knees weak and my hands trembling. I leaned against the kitchen island, letting out a long, shaky breath. Terrence turned around his shoulders, dropping as the immense physical tension left his body. He walked over and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight, grounding embrace. I rested my forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. We did not need to have a long, drawn-out conversation about what had just transpired. We both understood the gravity of the line that had been permanently crossed. They had weaponized my past, invaded my sanctuary, and threatened to steal our property. There was absolutely no coming back from this, and frankly, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief that the charade was finally over. I pulled away from Terrence, reached onto the counter, and handed him my cell phone. "Call an emergency locksmith," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute finality. "I do not care what the late-night surcharge costs. Pay double if you have to. I want every single exterior lock on this house changed immediately." Terrence nodded, taking the phone without a single word of debate. Within 45 minutes, a commercial locksmith van pulled into our driveway. We paid an exorbitant fee to have heavy-duty, high-security deadbolts installed on the front door, the back patio, and the side garage entrance. I stood in the foyer watching the technician swap out the old brass hardware, feeling a profound psychological shift with every turn of his screwdriver. The physical changing of the locks represented the permanent closing of a door I had left cracked open for far too long. They could no longer breach my sanctuary. By the time the locksmith departed, the clock was nearing midnight. The intense emotional labor of the evening had left both Terrence and me deeply exhausted. We walked upstairs together, checking on our two young children. They were both sound asleep, completely undisturbed by the chaotic intrusion that had occurred just downstairs. I pulled the blanket up to my son's shoulders and gently brushed a stray curl away from my daughter's face. Looking at my beautiful, peaceful children, my resolve hardened into impenetrable steel. I would never allow my parents' toxic dysfunction to bleed into their lives. The generational cycle officially stopped with me. Terrence and I walked back downstairs to the living room, ready to finally exhale and reclaim the peace of our home. I moved toward the kitchen to pour a fresh glass of water, letting my shoulders drop, believing the nightmare of the day was definitively over. Suddenly, a series of heavy, authoritative pounds rattled our brand-new front door. The impacts were incredibly aggressive, demanding immediate entry, completely unlike the polite knock of a late-night visitor. The sound echoed violently through the quiet house, making me jump backward and drop my glass into the sink. The harsh, strobing illumination turned our peaceful living room into a surreal crime scene. The red and blue lights cut through the slats of the blinds, slicing across the darkness and reflecting off the hardwood floors. For a fraction of a second, my brain refused to process what was happening. We had just changed the locks. We had just secured our perimeter. We had just drawn the final boundary against my toxic family. And now the police were parked on my front lawn. Terrence moved instantly. His protective instincts kicking into overdrive, he stepped in front of me, shielding my body with his own. He did not say a single word, but the rigid tension in his broad shoulders communicated everything. We were a young, successful black couple living in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. Having a marked patrol cruiser pull up to our property with its lights blazing in the middle of the night was not just an inconvenience. It was an inherently dangerous escalation. "Stay behind me," Terrence ordered, his voice dropping to a low, calm register designed to keep panic at bay. "Let me do the talking." I shook my head, stepping out from behind him and taking my place firmly at his side. "Absolutely not," I replied, my tone matching his absolute steadiness. "This is my father doing, this is his mess, we face this together. The aggressive pounding struck the heavy wood again, shaking the door in its frame. "Police department, open up," a loud, authoritative voice commanded from the other side. I reached out and grasped the brand new brass deadbolt that the locksmith had installed mere minutes ago. The metal was still cold. With a sharp, definitive click, I threw the latch and pulled the door open, leaving the heavy security screen locked between us and the porch. Two uniformed police officers stood squarely under the harsh glare of my exterior lights. The lead officer was an older man with graying temples, a thick mustache, and a posture that radiated cynical authority. His partner was much younger, looking barely out of the police academy, his hand resting entirely too close to the heavy flashlight on his utility belt. Beyond them, parked at an aggressive diagonal angle that blocked our entire driveway, was their cruiser. Across the street, I could already see porch lights flicking on. The Martinez family next door pulled back their curtains. My father was turning our private family dispute into a neighborhood spectacle. And standing perfectly shielded behind the broad shoulders of the two armed officers was Vernon. The physical transformation my father had undergone in the span of an hour was nothing short of a theatrical masterpiece. The aggressive red-faced bully, who had just tried to physically muscle his way into my home office and steal my husband's golf clubs, was completely gone. The loud, entitled man demanding $6,000 for a country club wedding had vanished into thin air. In his place stood a fragile, trembling elderly victim. Vernon had deliberately hunched his shoulders forward, pulling his expensive custom-tailored suit jacket tightly around his chest as if he were freezing. He was physically shaking, his hands trembling visibly as he clutched a crumpled white handkerchief. His eyes were wide, watery, and darting around nervously, portraying a man who was genuinely terrified for his life. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of absolute distress. "Good evening, sir," the older officer barked, focusing his stern gaze entirely on Terrence. "We received an emergency dispatch call regarding a domestic disturbance and a high-value theft at this residence. Are you the property owners?" "Yes, officer," Terrence replied, keeping his hands completely visible, resting them lightly against the doorframe. "We own this home. There is no domestic disturbance happening here. We were simply getting ready for bed." The younger officer shined his high-powered flashlight directly into our eyes, forcing me to blink against the blinding beam. "The gentleman behind us claims otherwise," the younger officer stated, his voice crisp and accusatory. "He states that he is your father-in-law. He reported that he came over this evening to peacefully retrieve specific family property, and that he was violently assaulted and thrown out of the house." Before Terrence could even formulate a response, Vernon let out a pathetic, wavering gasp. He stepped out slightly from behind the older officer, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "That is her," Officer Vernon whimpered, his voice cracking with magnificent artificial grief. "That is my daughter Jada. She took everything." The older officer held up a gloved hand, instructing Vernon to step back. The officer then turned his unyielding focus onto me. "Ma'am, your father claims that you have unlawfully seized his late mother's estate jewelry. He specifically listed a vintage platinum diamond brooch and two heirloom pearl necklaces. He states that you invited him over under false pretenses, forcibly took the items from his possession, and then locked him out of the house." The sheer magnitude of the lie sucked the oxygen straight out of the cold night air. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the absolute sociopathy required to execute this stunt. Vernon was not just trying to extort catering money from me anymore. He was actively attempting to weaponize the criminal justice system to punish me for closing my bank account to his endless demands. He was perfectly willing to have his own daughter arrested, placed in handcuffs, and dragged out of her home in front of her sleeping children just to save his fragile pride. "They are family heirlooms," Vernon cried out, his voice rising in an impressive crescendo of fake devastation. "They are all I have left of my dear departed mother. They were meant for my youngest daughter Chloe to wear at her upcoming wedding. They are a priceless family legacy, and she is holding them hostage in there out of pure spite. I demand that you search the premises immediately, officers. They are in her office. She has a heavy safe in there. You have to get my mother diamonds back before she sells them. Arrest her." The officers immediately stiffened, taking the allegation of grand larceny with absolute seriousness. The older officer stepped closer to the screen door, his eyes scanning the brand new brass hardware. He reached out and tapped his pen against the shining metal of the newly installed deadbolt. Your father informed dispatch that after he was assaulted, you immediately changed the locks to secure the stolen property inside. The older officer noted, his tone dripping with heavy suspicion. And it appears he was telling the truth about the hardware. The metal shavings are still sitting on your welcome mat. This does not look good for you folks. We need you to open this screen door right now. We need to step inside and conduct a full preliminary search of the premises to verify the location and status of the property in question. Terrence's jaw locked so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding together. The muscles in his forearms coiled as he stared down the men, demanding entry into his sanctuary. I placed my hand firmly over his wrist, applying a steady downward pressure to keep him anchored. I knew exactly what game Vernon was playing. He did not want the jewelry. He just wanted the police to force their way into my home so he could terrorize me, humiliate me in front of my neighbors, and assert his ultimate dominance. He wanted to prove that he could break into my house using the law as his personal battering ram. I looked past the officers, locking eyes with my father. He dropped the trembling victim act for a fraction of a second, offering me the faintest, most imperceptible smirk of victory. He thought he had me cornered. He thought his lie was bulletproof. "No, officer," I replied, my voice dropping to a calm, icy register that sliced through the tension. "You absolutely may not search my home." The 2 weeks following the police incident at my house were blissfully completely silent. The formal trespass order we had filed against my father acted as an invisible electric fence, keeping his toxic chaos entirely off our property. Terrence and I settled back into our peaceful routine, enjoying the quiet evenings with our children without the looming threat of extortion. I honestly believed my family had finally realized they had pushed me too far and had decided to cut their losses. That naive illusion was shattered when a heavy cream-colored envelope arrived in our mailbox. It was a formal invitation to Chloe and Connor engagement gala. The event was not being hosted by my parents. It was being entirely funded and organized by Connor parents, Eleanor and Richard Thornton. They had rented out the grand ballroom at the Oak Ridge Country Club, an exclusive members-only establishment that required a 6-figure initiation fee just to walk through the front doors. Because the Thorntons were controlling the guest list and handling the mailings, my parents had no way to intercept my invitation. Terrence and I sat at our kitchen island, staring at the gold foil lettering. Going meant willingly walking into a social minefield. Staying home meant allowing my parents to control the narrative and whisper lies to the Thorntons about my absence. Terrence reached across the granite countertop and covered my hand with his. "We are not hiding in our own lives, Jada," he said, his voice a steady, comforting rumble. "We are going to put on our best clothes, we are going to eat their expensive food, and we are going to hold our heads high. You have absolutely nothing to be ashamed of." I was right. I refused to let Vernon and Brenda bully me into the shadows. On the evening of the gala, I wore a floor-length midnight blue silk gown that draped perfectly over my frame. Terrence wore a custom-tailored charcoal tuxedo that highlighted his broad, athletic shoulders. We pulled up to the Oak Ridge Country Club, handed our keys to the valet, and walked up the sweeping marble staircase into the grand foyer. The Thorntons had spared absolutely no expense. A live string quartet played classical music from a raised balcony. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the room, illuminating towering centerpieces of imported white orchids and cascading ivy. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and caviar hors d'oeuvres. This was the exact high society world my mother and father had been desperately trying to claw their way into for decades. We spotted my family almost immediately. Vernon was wearing a rented tuxedo that fit him poorly around the waist, standing near the ice sculpture, and laughing too loudly at a joke Richard Thornton had just made. Brenda was clutching a glass of champagne, wearing a heavy pearl necklace that I instantly recognized as a cheap cubic zirconia replica of the family heirlooms Vernon had pawned 5 years ago. Chloe was clinging to Connor, arm-wearing a white designer cocktail dress, and flashing a blindingly white smile at anyone who looked her way. The moment Vernon locked eyes with me across the ballroom, His loud laughter abruptly died in his throat. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the chandelier light. Brenda followed his gaze and nearly dropped her champagne flute. They had clearly banked on me being too intimidated to show up. I offered them a slow, chillingly polite smile and turned away, taking Terrence's arm as we moved to greet the hosts. Eleanor Thornton was a remarkably gracious woman, entirely oblivious to the vicious covert war raging on the other side of the room. She hugged me warmly, complimenting my gown, and expressing how thrilled she was to have both sides of the family merging. I smiled and played the part of the supportive sister, perfectly exchanging pleasantries and sipping my sparkling water. Throughout the 2-hour cocktail reception, my parents avoided me like a highly contagious disease. They stayed on the opposite side of the ballroom, physically shielding Chloe whenever Terrence and I walked past. They were terrified. They knew I was a walking bomb equipped with enough explosive truth to obliterate their entire social standing, but they were trapped by their own lies. They had to play the role of the loving, happy family for the Thorntons. Eventually, the event coordinator chimed a soft bell, directing the 200 guests to find their assigned seats for the plated dinner service. Terrence and I were seated at table 4, providing us with an unobstructed front row view of the elevated head table where my parents sat, flanking the engaged couple alongside the Thorntons. Dinner was a lavish 5-course affair, featuring lobster bisque, filet mignon, and truffle mashed potatoes. As the final dessert plates were being cleared away, the room began to quiet down. It was time for the formal speeches. Richard Thornton stood first, adjusting his silk tie. He delivered a polished, heartwarming speech about watching his son grow into a fine young man and welcoming Chloe into their family with open arms. He raised his glass to a chorus of polite, affluent applause. Then it was Vernon's turn. My father stood up from his chair, smoothing the lapels of his rented jacket. He was sweating profusely, a thin sheen of moisture gleaming on his forehead. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and grabbed a heavy silver dessert spoon. Vernon clinks his crystal glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sound cut through the low murmur of the ballroom, commanding immediate, absolute attention from the 200 wealthy guests. He cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone set up on the head table. He plastered a fake, benevolent smile onto his face, radiating the manufactured warmth of a proud patriarch. He spoke about how fast time flies, about watching Chloe take her first steps, and about how proud he was to hand his youngest daughter over to such a distinguished family. The Thorntons beamed, nodding along with his empty platitudes. But as Vernon spoke, his eyes began to dart toward my table. I could see the frantic, desperate gears turning in his head. The final catering bill was due in less than a week. The Thorntons had likely been casually discussing wedding expenses all evening, putting immense psychological pressure on him. Vernon had no money. He had exhausted his credit limits. He was backed into a massive financial corner with zero avenues of escape. In that moment of sheer panic, Vernon made a catastrophic tactical error. He decided to weaponize the public setting against me. He assumed that because we were surrounded by Connor high society parents and hundreds of their wealthy friends, I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene. He thought the crushing weight of public social pressure would force me into submission. He decided to execute a public ambush to extort the money he desperately needed. Vernon shifted his posture, gripping the microphone tighter. He looked directly at me, his benevolent smile twisting into something uniquely sinister. "We all make mistakes," Vernon announced, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system, carrying to every single corner of the silent ballroom. "My eldest daughter Jada has had a rough time lately, dropping the ball on family duties. But she is here tonight to make things right and present her sister with a very special wedding gift." The entire ballroom went dead silent. 200 heads turned simultaneously. Diamond earrings caught the light as the elite guests shifted their gaze from the head table directly to me. Vernon stepped out from behind the head table. He extended his thick arm, holding his hand out directly toward my table, palm facing upward. I was literally demanding that I stand up, walk across the ballroom, and hand him a check for $6,000 right there in front of the entire Thornton family. He expected me to write the check simply to avoid the profound public humiliation of declining his grand gesture. Brenda looked terrified, gripping the edge of the tablecloth so hard her knuckles turned white. Chloe was holding her breath, her eyes wide with panicked anticipation. Connor looked incredibly confused, leaning toward his mother to whisper a question. Eleanor and Richard Thornton looked on with polite, expectant smiles, assuming this was some sort of traditional family custom or a grand, touching display of sisterly love. Beside me, Terence instantly tensed. I felt the massive muscles in his thigh flex as he prepared to stand up and physically shut Vernon down. I reached out under the table and placed my hand firmly over his knee, squeezing twice. I did not need Terence to protect me from this. I had this entirely under control. I stayed seated perfectly still. The old Jada, the daughter who desperately craved her father approval and feared his booming voice would have withered under the intense staring eyes of 200 country club elites. The old Jada would have pulled her checkbook from her clutch and frantically scribbled out her savings just to make the agonizing awkwardness stop. The new Jada, the woman who had survived being robbed, the woman who had watched her father attempt to use armed police officers as his personal debt collectors, felt absolutely nothing but a cold surgical precision. I did not break eye contact with Vernon. I did not shift in my seat. I did not offer a polite, socially acceptable smile to diffuse the tension. I simply stared at him with eyes as dead and flat as a frozen lake. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Vernon's outstretched hand began to tremble slightly under the crushing weight of the prolonged quiet. The polite smiles on the faces of the Thornton family began to falter, replaced by deep, uncomfortable confusion. Guests at the surrounding tables began to shift awkwardly in their seats, exchanging concerned whispers. The grand, heartwarming gesture Vernon had attempted to orchestrate was rapidly mutating into a bizarre, deeply uncomfortable standoff. I let him hang there. I let the silence become deafening, allowing the sheer weight of his own inappropriate ambush to slowly crush the air out of his lungs. I sat in my expensive silk gown flanked by my powerful husband, and I turned his public extortion attempt into his own public execution. Slowly and deliberately, I pushed my chair back from table 4. The wooden legs scraped against the polished ballroom floor, producing a sharp, abrasive sound that echoed through the paralyzing silence. I stood up, smoothing the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown. Beside me, Terence remained seated, but his posture was completely rigid, his eyes tracking every single movement in the room like a hawk. He reached inside the breast pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket and withdrew a thick, heavily folded manila envelope. He handed it to me without a word. His unwavering support was a physical force propelling me forward. I took the envelope and stepped away from our table. I did not rush. I walked gracefully across the expanse of the Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom, my head held high, my shoulders pulled back. Every single pair of eyes in the room tracked my progress. 200 affluent guests held their collective breath, waiting to see if the estranged daughter was actually going to submit to this grotesque public shaming. I could hear the faint rustle of expensive fabrics as people leaned in, straining to witness the spectacle. Up at the head table, the dynamic was rapidly shifting. As I closed the distance, Vernon's chest puffed out. The arrogant smugness returned to his flushed face. He honestly believed he had won. He believed that the sheer crushing pressure of high society etiquette had broken my resolve, and that I was walking up there to hand him a blank check to save face. Brenda let out a long, audible breath of relief, unclenching her hands from the tablecloth. Chloe sat up straighter, flashing a brilliant manufactured smile toward Connor parents, attempting to seamlessly weave this moment into her perfect engagement narrative. I reached the elevated head table and stepped up onto the small riser, bringing myself directly to eye level with my family and the Thornton patriarchs. I turned to Eleanor and Richard Thornton, first offering them a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you so much for hosting such a beautiful, elegant evening," I said, my voice perfectly modulated and polite. "The floral arrangements are absolutely breathtaking, Eleanor. You have exquisite taste." Eleanor blinked, clearly taken aback by my calm, pleasant demeanor in the face of my father's aggressive ambush. "Thank you, Jada," she replied, her voice wavering slightly with uncertainty. I turned my attention back to Vernon. He was standing there with his thick hand still outstretched, palm up, waiting for his ultimate victory. The greed radiating from him was a palpable toxic energy. I looked him dead in the eye, maintaining my warm, serene smile. You wanted a special wedding gift, Vernon, I asked, my voice carrying easily over the front rows of tables. You wanted to discuss my family duties in front of all these wonderful people. Yes, Jada, Vernon replied, his tone dripping with patronizing authority. It is time to step up and support your sister. I placed the thick manila envelope directly into his open palm. Vernon snatched it eagerly. He did not even bother to sit down. His greed completely overrode his sense of decorum. He ripped the top of the envelope open right there at the microphone, tearing the heavy paper in his haste to get to the money. He pulled out the thick stack of documents inside. I watched his eyes scan the bold black lettering at the top of the first page. The transition was instantaneous and absolutely spectacular. Vernon's triumphant smile did not just fade, it violently shattered. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked as though he had been physically struck. His mouth fell open, exposing his teeth as a strangled, gasping sound escaped his throat. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy legal papers rattled loudly against the wooden podium. He flipped wildly to the second page, then the third, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. Brenda sensed the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. She leaned over, craning her neck to read the documents in his trembling hands. A shrill, piercing gasp ripped from her lungs. She slapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes bulging out of her head as she looked from the papers up to my face in absolute terror. I did not whisper. I did not lean in to keep family matters private. Vernon had demanded a public spectacle, and I was more than happy to oblige. I squared my shoulders and projected my voice with crisp, flawless diction, ensuring that every single syllable carried through the microphone and reached the very back of the ballroom. Since we are talking about real estate and family duties in front of Connor lovely parents, I thought you would want these immediately, I announced, my voice ringing like a bell. It is the formal 30-day notice to vacate the property, along with the itemized ledger of your unpaid rent. Eleanor Thornton let out a loud, audible gasp, pressing a manicured hand to her pearl necklace. Richard Thornton dropped his dessert fork onto his china plate with a loud clatter. Vernon stumbled backward, bumping into his chair. "What is this?" He choked out, his voice reduced to a pathetic wet wheeze. "How do you have this? This is impossible." "It is very possible, Vernon," I replied, taking a step closer to him. "Did you honestly believe a faceless corporate entity bought your house when the bank finally foreclosed on you 2 years ago? Did you think some anonymous property management group was just generously letting you live in a luxury 5-bedroom estate out of the goodness of their hearts?" The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The wealthy guests who had been prepared to witness a heartwarming family reconciliation were now completely paralyzed, watching a brutal, high-stakes financial execution. "You stopped paying your mortgage because you were financing Chloe designer wardrobe and Brenda leased cars." I continued, exposing the ugly, rotting truth beneath their fake wealth. "When the bank auctioned off your property to recover the debt, my husband and I formed a private LLC and purchased the deed. We bought the house, Vernon. We own the roof over your head. We allowed you to sign a standard residential lease because, despite everything, I did not want my parents to be homeless." Chloe let out a strangled cry, gripping Connor's arms so hard her acrylic nails dug into his tuxedo jacket. "No," she whimpered. "No, that is not true. Daddy, tell them it is a lie. Tell them we own the house." Vernon could not speak. He was staring at the official deed transfer and the notarized eviction notice in his hands, completely immobilized by the shock of his own destruction. "You stopped paying us rent 6 months ago. Vernon." I projected, my voice cutting through. Chloe panicked whimpers. "You ignored every single default notice my property manager sent you. You claimed you were experiencing temporary cash flow issues. But now I see exactly where my rent money went. It went toward buying fake pearls and renting a tuxedo to come to this country club and pretend you belong in the same tax bracket as the Thornton family." Connor physically pulled his arm away from Chloe's grasp. He looked at my sister as if he were seeing a stranger. His face was a picture of dawning realization and deep, profound embarrassment. He looked at his father, Richard, whose face had turned a furious shade of crimson. The Thorntons were legacy wealth. They despised nothing more than social climbers and financial fraudsters. Vernon had just been exposed as both. You tried to extort $6,000 from me tonight to pay for a catering bill you cannot afford, I said, my tone dropping into a cold, deadly register. You tried to humiliate me into funding your lies. So consider this notice your final reality check. You have exactly 30 days to pack up whatever cheap replica jewelry and rented suits you have left and vacate my property. If you are not gone by the first of the month, I will have the county sheriff physically remove your belongings and place them on the curb. Brenda burst into hysterical tears, burying her face in her hands. Vernon's legs finally gave out. He collapsed heavily into his chair, the legal documents spilling out of his hands and scattering across the pristine white tablecloth. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man staring blankly at the floral centerpiece. I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. The absolute devastation written across their faces was all the closure I would ever require. I turned my back on the head table. I offered one final polite nod to Eleanor and Richard Thornton, who were both sitting in stunned, horrified silence. Then I walked gracefully down the steps of the riser and back across the ballroom. The sea of affluent guests parted for me immediately, stepping out of my way with wide, shocked eyes. Terence was already standing at our table waiting for me. He offered me his arm, his face beaming with an immense, quiet pride. I looped my arm through his, holding my head high as we walked out of the grand ballroom together, leaving the shattered remnants of my family, fake empire completely exposed for the entire world to see. Terence and I had made it exactly halfway across the sprawling expanse of the Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom when a commanding, deeply furious voice shattered the stunned silence. "Jada, stop right there." The voice belonged to Richard Thornton. He had pushed his heavy mahogany chair back from the head table with such force that it nearly toppled over the wooden legs, loudly scraping the polished floor. He was not looking at Vernon. He was looking directly at me. The polite aristocratic patriarch who had just toasted to family unity was completely gone. In his place stood a shrewd, fiercely protective businessman who suddenly realized his family was standing in the middle of a massive, undisclosed blast zone. Terrence's hand tightened protectively on my arm, instinctively preparing to keep us moving toward the exit, but I gently touched his wrist to halt our momentum. I turned around, my heavy silk gown pooling gracefully around my heels, and faced the elevated head table once more. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his face a tight mask of rigid authority. He gestured sharply toward Vernon, who was still slumped heavily in his chair, hyperventilating as he stared blindly at the documents in his lap. "What is going on here?" Vernon claimed he needed to collect a wedding contribution. "You just handed him an eviction notice. Explain yourself." I looked at Richard, then at his wife Eleanor, who was clutching her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically between my father and me. I felt no malice toward the Thorntons. They were simply collateral damage in my family's relentless, pathetic pursuit of unearned status. But they deserved the unvarnished truth before they legally bound their son to a sinking ship. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with the icy, surgical precision of a senior data analyst presenting a catastrophic quarterly report. "I apologize for the disruption to your beautiful evening, Richard." I began, my voice perfectly steady, carrying effortlessly through the dead quiet of the room. "But since my father decided to utilize your generous hospitality to stage a public extortion attempt against me, I believe you and Eleanor are entitled to the full, unedited context of exactly who you are dealing with." Vernon let out a pathetic whimpering sound, shaking his head slightly, but he lacked the physical strength or the courage to stand up and stop me. "Vernon is not a commercial real estate mogul." I stated the truth, slicing through the ballroom like a scalpel. "He is completely bankrupt. He has not closed a successful, profitable deal in over 6 years. His entire business model consists of shuffling high-interest loans between shell companies to maintain the illusion of liquid wealth. He is drowning in debt and his credit is non-existent." A collective horrified murmur rippled through the 200 affluent guests. This was the ultimate taboo in their exclusive world, not just losing money, but faking it. "That $6,000 he just stood up and publicly demanded from me," I continued, locking eyes with Connor, who was sitting frozen beside Chloe. "He claimed it was to cover a sudden oversight in Chloe's catering bill, but you and I both know the Thorntons generously covered the catering in full months ago." Connor blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening as the realization began to dawn on him. He looked at Vernon, then down at the papers scattered across the pristine white tablecloth. That money was never for a wedding gift, I declared, tearing down the final pillar of Vernon's grand illusion. It was a desperate last-minute grab for cash to stop a bank auction. Vernon leveraged an off-the-books commercial property to the absolute hilt, and he missed the final grace period. $6,000 is the exact amount required by the bank to cover the immediate penalty fees and delay the foreclosure auction by a mere 30 days. Brenda buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with loud, humiliating sobs. She knew her days of country club luncheons and leased luxury vehicles were permanently over. "And the absolute cherry on top, Richard?" I asked, allowing a thin, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. "The bank decided to offload that toxic asset to recoup their losses. My husband and I used our corporate analytics firm to track the sale. My LLC officially purchased the secondary debt on that property last Thursday. He doesn't just owe the bank anymore, he owes me. He tried to extort his own daughter in public to pay a debt he owes to her own company." Shut up, you jealous, bitter liar!" The piercing, hysterical scream ripped from Chloe's throat. She leaped out of her chair, knocking it backward. Her pristine white designer cocktail dress swirled violently around her legs. The carefully curated image of the blushing, elegant bride instantly evaporated, replaced by the vicious, entitled bully I had known my entire life. Chloe pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure panic. "Do not listen to her, Connor. She is lying. She has always hated me. She is just jealous because I am marrying into a good family and having a beautiful wedding. She is a miserable, psychotic liar trying to ruin my perfect day." She reached out, grabbing Connor's tuxedo sleeve, her acrylic nails digging into the expensive fabric. "Connor, tell them to throw her out. Call security, Daddy, do something." But Vernon did nothing. He just sat there, sweating profusely, staring blankly at the table. Connor did not call security. He did not reach out to comfort his screaming fiancée. He slowly, deliberately pried Chloe's fingers off his arm, his expression hardening into impenetrable stone. He was a wealthy young man, but he was not a fool. The aggressive defensiveness, the public extortion attempt, the sheer undeniable terror radiating from Vernon and Brenda, it all painted a horrifyingly clear picture. He realized with crushing clarity that he was not marrying the love of his life. He was being recruited as a financial life raft by a family of broke grifters desperately trying to leech off his trust fund. Connor stood up. He ignored Chloe's frantic pleading and walked directly over to Vernon's chair. Without asking for permission, Connor reached down and snatched the thick stack of legal documents right out of Vernon's shaking hands. Vernon let out a weak gasp of protest, but he offered absolutely no physical resistance. The ballroom watched in absolute paralyzed silence as Connor flipped through the papers. He read the 30-day notice to vacate. He read the itemized ledger of unpaid rent on their primary residence. He read the formal transfer of the secondary commercial debt, clearly displaying my LLC's name at the top of the page. It was the undeniable, legally binding proof of their total catastrophic bankruptcy. Connor's face turned an ash gray. The illusion was completely shattered. He had been duped, lied to, and nearly chained to a family that would have drained his inheritance dry to maintain their fake lifestyle. With a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, Connor dropped the entire stack of papers right onto his half-eaten plate of filet mignon. The heavy document slapped against the fine china. The dark truffle sauce and grease immediately soaked into the thick paper, staining the eviction notice permanently. It was an act of supreme disrespect, a physical manifestation of his utter revulsion. He leaned down, placing both hands firmly on the table, and looked directly into Vernon's terrified, watery eyes. "Is this true?" Connor demanded, his voice a low, lethal whisper that carried perfectly through the silent room. Vernon's mouth opened. He licked his dry lips. He looked at Richard, who was glaring at him with supreme aristocratic rage. He looked at Eleanor, who was quietly weeping in humiliation. He looked at Chloe, who was shaking her head violently, silently begging him to lie. Vernon had no answer. He just hung his heavy head in silent, pathetic defeat. Connor slowly straightened his posture. He turned his head and looked at Chloe. The warmth, the affection, the love that had been there just an hour ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hollow contempt. Connor, please. Chloe whimpered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her pristine makeup. We can fix this. I love you. We are done. Connor stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. He did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene. He simply turned his back on my sister, stepped off the riser, and walked away. He strode purposefully through the parted sea of silent, staring guests, walking out of the grand ballroom and out of her life without looking back. Exactly 7 days passed. 7 days of absolute uninterrupted tranquility. The heavy, oppressive cloud that had hung over my entire adult life had finally dissipated, leaving behind a crisp, clean reality. Terrence and I spent our evenings cooking dinner together, helping Malik and Aliyah with their homework, and enjoying the simple, profound peace of a home secured against toxic intruders. I had fully expected a barrage of angry text messages or unhinged emails, but the silence from my family was absolute. I assumed they were too busy drowning in the catastrophic fallout of the cancelled wedding and their impending eviction to bother me. I was wrong. They were simply regrouping for one final desperate assault on my boundaries. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was working from my home office, analyzing a complex dataset for an upcoming quarterly review, when the security notification chimed on my desktop monitor. I minimized my spreadsheet and pulled up the live feed from our exterior cameras. Vernon and Brenda were standing on the wet concrete of the public sidewalk at the end of our driveway. They looked entirely foreign to me. The polished, arrogant country club facade had been thoroughly washed away by the sheer terror of their financial ruin. Vernon was wearing a wrinkled raincoat, his shoulders slumped, his posture devoid of its usual aggressive swagger. Brenda stood beside him, holding a cheap umbrella, looking haggard and incredibly small. They were staring up the driveway, physically blocked by the massive wrought iron security gate Terrence had commissioned immediately following the country club incident. The gate was 8 feet tall, reinforced steel, and required a digital passcode for entry. It was a monolithic, undeniable physical boundary that kept them exactly where they belonged, on the outside looking in. I watched through the high-definition camera as Vernon reached out and pressed the intercom button mounted on the stone pillar. A soft buzz echoed from the control panel in my hallway. I did not move from my desk chair. I simply watched them standing in the rain. Vernon pressed the button again, leaning closer to the speaker. When I still did not answer, he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. A moment later, my personal cell phone lit up on my desk. I watched it ring the screen, displaying his name until the call finally rolled over to voicemail. A notification pinged. He had left a message. I waited until I saw them slowly turn around and trudge back to their sedan before I picked up my phone. I hit play on the voicemail, resting my elbows on my desk as Vernon's voice filled the quiet office. "Jada, please pick up the phone." Vernon's voice crackled through the speaker. He was crying. It was a pathetic, wet wheezing sound that I had never heard him make in my entire life. "I am begging you. You have to stop this eviction. We have absolutely nowhere to go. My accounts are frozen. The investors backed out. Chloe moved into a cheap motel and she refuses to speak to us. Your mother is sick with worry. She cannot stop crying." He paused, drawing a ragged, shaking breath. "You cannot do this to us, Jada," he pleaded, attempting to invoke the very loyalty he had exploited for decades. "You are our daughter. We raised you. We are blood. Family forgives. Please call me back. We can fix this. I am your father." I deleted the voicemail with a single tap of my finger. The sheer monumental hypocrisy of his words was staggering. He had never considered me blood when he was mocking my career choices. He had never considered me family when he was pawning heirlooms and demanding I pay for my sister's catering bill. He only remembered his paternal title when he needed me to act as his financial shield. I decided in that exact moment to sever the cord completely. I would not leave this unresolved. I would not allow them to harbor any lingering hope that they could manipulate their way back into my life. I picked up my phone and typed a brief clinical text message. "Meet me at the downtown roast coffee shop tomorrow at noon. Do not be late. This will be our final conversation." I sent the message, closed my laptop, and walked out of my office. The next day I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early. I wore a sharp, tailored gray blazer and slacks, projecting the absolute authority of a woman completely in control of her life. I ordered a black coffee, selected a table in the corner near the large glass windows, and waited. Vernon and Brenda walked through the door precisely at noon. They looked even worse in the harsh daylight. The exhaustion and stress had carved deep permanent lines into their faces. They spotted me and hurried over, pulling out the chairs across from me with trembling hands. Brenda gasped, reaching her hand across the small wooden table as if to touch mine. Thank God. We knew you would come to your senses. We knew you would not put your own parents on the street. I smoothly pulled my hands back, resting them in my lap, leaving her grasping at empty air. I am not here to negotiate, Brenda. I stated, my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of emotion. I am here to deliver your final terms. Vernon swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the bustling coffee shop. Jada, please be reasonable. We are family. You have the money. You own the debt. You can just cancel the eviction and let us stay. We will pay you back. I swear it. You have absolutely zero capacity to pay me back, Vernon, I replied, surgically dismantling his delusion. I audited your accounts 5 years ago. I know exactly how deep in the red you are. Furthermore, I have zero interest in acting as your landlord. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a sleek manila folder. I opened it and slid a glossy, professionally printed real estate brochure across the table. Vernon stared at the paper. It was a high-end listing for his house. I am putting the property on the market tomorrow morning, I announced, watching the last remaining shred of color drain from his face. I need to recoup the capital I exhausted saving you from yourselves. I am selling the house to the highest bidder. Your 30-day notice stands. You have exactly 23 days left to pack your belongings and vacate the premises. You cannot do this! Brenda wailed, her voice rising in pitch, causing a few nearby patrons to glance in our direction. Where are we supposed to go? We have no money. I slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a printed list of affordable low-income apartment complexes in the surrounding municipal area. I suggest you start making phone calls. I advised, my tone perfectly flat. These complexes do not require pristine credit scores. They are safe, and they are within your current non-existent budget. Vernon stared at the list of cheap apartments, his jaw trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and furious disbelief. You are throwing your own parents into the gutter over a misunderstanding. It was not a misunderstanding, Vernon, I corrected sharply, leaning forward so he could hear every single syllable. It was a lifetime of abuse. It was decades of using me as your emotional punching bag and your financial backup plan. You made your choices. Now you get to live in the reality you created. I reached back into my tote bag and pulled out my checkbook. I unspooled a sleek silver pen and quickly wrote out a check. I tore it from the ledger and slid it face up across the table directly in front of Vernon. Vernon looked down at the check, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. It was a check made out to Vernon for exactly $6.00. What is this? He demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, offended whisper. $6. What kind of sick joke is this? You tried to extort $6,000 from me in front of 200 people. I reminded him, the memory of his public ambush flashing in my mind. You tried to humiliate me into funding Chloe lies. Consider this check my final contribution to your family. It should cover the cost of a single pack of cardboard moving boxes from the hardware store. Brenda let out a choked, horrified sob, covering her mouth with both hands. We are done, I stated, standing up from the table. I smoothed my blazer, looking down at the two strangers sitting before me. Do not call me. Do not show up at my gate. If you are not out of that house by the 1st of the month, my property manager will arrive with the local sheriff, and you will be escorted off the premises in handcuffs. Have a nice life. I turned on my heel and walked out of the coffee shop. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright, warm sunlight of the city street. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, opened my contact list, and permanently blocked both of their phone numbers. I deleted their contact files entirely. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh city air. The heavy, invisible chains that had bound me to their toxic approval shattered completely, falling away into nothingness. I walked down the street feeling an incredible, soaring sense of absolute liberation. 4 months later, the bitter memory of that coffee shop felt like a lifetime away. I was lying on a plush white lounge chair, sinking my toes into the pristine powdery sand of a private beach in Jamaica. The crystal clear turquoise water of the Caribbean Sea lapped gently against the shoreline, creating a soothing rhythmic melody. The warm tropical sun beat down on my skin, melting away any lingering stress from the corporate world. Down by the water, Terence was laughing loudly, lifting our son Malik onto his broad shoulders, while Aaliyah splashed happily in the shallow waves. My husband looked over at me, flashing that brilliant warm smile that had anchored me through the darkest storms of my life. I smiled back, raising my glass of iced fruit juice in a silent toast to the incredible man I had married. We were not just celebrating our survival, we were celebrating a massive triumph. Just last week, I had officially been promoted to Senior Director of Data Analytics for the entire regional division of my firm. The promotion came with a massive salary increase, stock options, and the absolute validation of my hard work. I had built an empire entirely on my own merit, without a single ounce of help from the people who had tried to break me. I rested my head back against the lounge chair, closing my eyes as the warm ocean breeze brushed past my face. As I listened to the joyous sound of my children laughing, my mind briefly wandered back to a memory from years ago. I remembered the day I graduated with my master's degree. I remembered sitting on that massive auditorium stage wearing my cap and gown, staring out into the sea of cheering families. I remembered looking at the 5 empty seats in the second row, the seats I had specifically reserved for my parents and my sister. They had not shown up. They had chosen to attend a backyard pool party instead, leaving me completely alone on one of the most important days of my professional life. For years, that memory had been a source of deep, agonizing pain. But sitting on this beautiful beach surrounded by the incredible family I had chosen and created, I finally understood the truth. Those empty seats at my graduation were not a tragedy. They were the greatest gift I had ever received. Those empty seats had forced me to realize my own intrinsic worth. They had taught me that true family is not determined by shared blood or obligatory titles. True family is determined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and the consistent daily choice to show up for the people you love. I opened my eyes looking out at Terence, Malik, and Aaliyah playing in the sunlit ocean. I had finally broken the cycle. I had protected my peace, and I had made room for the people who truly, genuinely mattered. I took a slow, deep breath of the salty ocean air, feeling a profound, absolute contentment settle over my soul. I had won. Lesson learned. The most profound lesson from this story is that shared blood does not automatically obligate you to endure systemic abuse, financial manipulation, or blatant disrespect. For years, the protagonist allowed her family's toxic expectations to dictate her worth, accepting constant belittlement simply to keep the peace. However, reaching her breaking point taught her that true security and validation must come from within. Setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a vital step for self-preservation. Ultimately, we learn that true family is consciously chosen, built on a steady foundation of mutual respect, genuine support, and unconditional love. Call to action. If you have ever had to set difficult but necessary boundaries to protect your peace from a toxic family dynamic, share your empowering story in the comments below.